podium here at Trump Tower, again, delivering remarks. He's taking it and he's saying thank you. The former president getting ready to speak just moments away after being convicted. Let's listen.
Let's go ahead and listen.
This is a case where if they can do this to me, they can do this to anyone. And these are bad people. These are, in many cases, I believe, sick people. When you look at our country, what's happening where millions and millions of people are flowing in from all parts of the world, not just South America, from Africa, from Asia, from the Middle East, and they're coming in from jails and prisons, and they're coming in from mental institutions and insane asylums. They're coming in from all over the world into our country. And we have a president and a group of fascists that don't want to do anything about it, because they could right now, today, he could stop it. But he's not. They're destroying our country. Our country is in very bad shape, and they're very much against me saying these things. They want to raise your taxes by 4 times. They want to stop you from having cars with their ridiculous mandates that make it impossible for you to get a car or afford a car, but make it very possible for China to build all of our cars. It's a very serious problem that we have. We just went through one of many experiences where we had a conflicted judge, highly conflicted. There's never been a more conflicted judge. Now, I'm under a gag order, which nobody's ever been under. No presidential candidate's ever been under a gag order before. I'm under a gag order, nasty gag order, where I've had to pay thousands of dollars in penalties and fines and was threatened with jail. Think of it, I'm the leading candidate. I'm leading Biden by a lot, and I'm leading the Republicans to the point where that's over. So I'm the leading person for president, and I'm under a gag order by a man that can't put 2 sentences together, given by a court, and they are in total conjunction with the White House and the DOJ, just so you understand. This is all done by Biden and his people. And maybe his people more importantly. I don't know if Biden knows too much about it, because I don't know if he knows about anything. But he's nevertheless the president, so we have to use his name. And this is done by Washington, and nobody's ever seen anything like it. So we have a judge who's highly conflicted. You know what the confliction is. Nobody wants to write about it, and I'm not allowed to talk about it. If I do, he said, I get put in jail. So we'll play that game a little bit longer. We won't talk about it, but you're allowed to talk about it. I hope you do, because there's never been anybody so conflicted as this. As far as the trial itself, it was very unfair. We weren't allowed to use our election expert under any circumstances. You saw what happened to some of the witnesses that were on our side. They were literally crucified by this man who looks like an angel, but he's really a devil. He looks so nice and soft. People say, oh, he seems like such a nice man. No, unless you saw him in action. And you saw that with a certain witness that went through hell. And when we wanted to do things, he wouldn't let us do those things. But when the government wanted something, they got everything. They got everything they wanted. It was a rigged trial. We wanted a venue change where we could have a fair trial. We didn't get it. We wanted a judge change. We wanted a judge that wasn't conflicted. And obviously he didn't do that. Nobody's ever seen anything like it. We had a DA who was a failed DA. Crime is rampant in New York, violent crime. That's what he's really supposed to be looking at. Crime is rampant in New York. Yesterday in McDonald's, you had a man hitting him up with machetes, a machete. Whoever can imagine even a machete being wielded in a store, in a place where they're eating, and he's going rampant. And Bragg is down watching a trial on what they call crimes. They're falsifying business records. That sounds so bad. To me, it sounds very bad. You know, it's only a misdemeanor, but to me, it sounds so bad. When they say falsifying business, that's a bad thing for me. I've never had that before. I'm falsifying. You know what falsifying business records is? In the first degree. They say falsifying business records sounds so good, right? It means that legal expense, I paid a lawyer, totally legal. I paid a lawyer a legal expense. And a bookkeeper, without any knowledge from me, correctly marked it down in the books. A very professional woman, highly respected, she testified, marked it down in the books as a legal expense. So a legal expense, paid a lawyer, is a legal expense in the books. It's not sheetrock, construction, or any other thing. It's a legal expense. Think of that. This is what the falsification of business records were. And I said, what else are you going to call it? What else are you going to call it? Now, I would have testified. I wanted to testify. The theory is you never testify, because as soon as you testify, anybody, if it were George Washington, don't testify, because they'll get you on something that you said slightly wrong, and then they sue you for perjury. But I didn't care about that. I wanted to. But the judge allowed them to go into everything that I was ever involved in, not this case, everything that I was ever involved in, which is a first. In other words, you could go into every single thing that I ever did. Was he a bad boy here? Was he a bad boy there? And my lawyer said, what do you need to go through? And all you wanted to do is testify simply on this case. Because I would have loved to have testified. To this day, I would have liked to have testified. But you would have said something out of whack, like it was a beautiful sunny day and it was actually raining out. And I very much appreciate the big crowd of people outside. That's incredible what's happening. The level of support has been incredible. So the whole thing is legal expense was marked down as legal expense. Think of it. This is the crime that I committed, that I'm supposed to go to jail for 187 years for. When you have violent crime all over this city at levels that nobody's ever seen before, where you have businesses leaving, and businesses are leaving because of this, because heads of businesses say, man, we don't want to get involved with that. I could go through the books of any business person in this city, and I could find things that, in theory, I guess, let's indict him, let's destroy his life. But I'm out there, and I don't mind being out there, because I'm doing something for this country, and I'm doing something for our Constitution. It's very important, far beyond me. And this can't be allowed to happen to other presidents. It should never be allowed to happen in the future. But this is far beyond me. This is bigger than Trump. This is bigger than me. This is bigger than my presidency. And the people understand it, because I just see a poll just came out, the Daily Mail. That was the first one, came out, was done last night right after the verdict, where I'm up 6 points. 6 points from what we already were. We were leading fairly substantially. We're up 6 points in the Daily Mail poll. Now, maybe other polls come out and it says something differently. But a lot of people have predicted it, because the public understands, and they understand what's going on. This is a scam. There's a rigged trial. It shouldn't have been in that venue. We shouldn't have had that judge. He should have allowed us to have an election expert. We had the best expert, most respected expert, head of the Federal Elections Commission. He was all set to testify. He was waiting for 2 days. And when it was his turn, Bragg's people protested, and the judge knocked him out, said you can't testify. He actually said you can't testify for anything having to do with the trial. You can say what the federal elections is. Well, that doesn't help. Everybody knows that. But you can't testify. So essentially, he wasn't able to testify. Other people weren't able to testify. But with these people, they were able to use people salacious. By the way, and nothing ever happened. There was no anything. Nothing ever happened, and they know it. But they were as salacious as they could be, and it had nothing to do with the case, but it had to do with politics. And do you notice the timing? The timing was perfect. This case was dead. It was dropped by every agency, every governmental board. It was dropped by the highly respected Southern District. They said, no, there's no case here. It was dropped by federal election, and that's what it's about. This is about a federal election, not a state election. You're not even allowed to look at it. They took the state and the city, and they went into a federal election. They're not allowed. the people from federal elections, Southern District and Washington, dropped the case. Everybody dropped the case. There was no case. Cy Vance dropped the case. And when Bragg came in, he said, this is the most ridiculous case I've ever seen. And who would have a certain person, again, gag order, who would have a certain person like this ever testify? He said, this is essentially one of the worst people I've ever seen ever to testify. He said, the craziest case I've ever seen. This is Bragg. Then when I announced I was running for president, a long time later, they decided to revive this case. And they got a judge, Judge Marchand, who was responsible for another case that was also brought. It destroyed the life of a very good man, by the way. Destroyed the life of a very good man who went to prison once, and then they just put him in prison again because they said he lied. He didn't lie. I looked at the statements he made. In fact, he didn't remember something, and they put him in jail. Again, they've destroyed him. With me for many years, he was an honorable person. He was an honest man. And if you look at what he did, supposedly, it never happened. There's never been anything like this. Over the education of his grandchildren. Over, he didn't report that he had a car or 2 cars on his income. I don't know. I wonder how many people here have cars. I wonder how many people said, oh, gee, I have a car that's worth X dollars. How do you even figure it? And I guess you do have to report it, but I would say probably almost nobody does. Nobody even thinks about it. They put this man, they destroyed this man, but they put him in jail again because they didn't want him to testify. They didn't want him to testify. That's why he went to jail. They put him in jail twice. He's 77 years old. Now, normally I'd say that's an old guy, but I don't feel 77. Nobody ever says that about me. I'd like them to say, gee, we have to have a little sorrow for this man, because they just don't say that about me, but maybe I'm better off that way. I think I'm probably better off that way. But they put him in jail twice. And you have to see what they put him in jail. And he was threatened by the judge. This man was told, you're going to get 15 years in jail if you don't give up Trump. And he was told that. You're going to get 15 years in jail. And he made a plea deal because he didn't want to spend the rest of his life. And he was told that viciously. We're living in a fascist state. He was told that viciously. So you can go to jail for 4 months, 5 months, or you can get 15 years in jail. So do a plea. Almost who wouldn't do that plea? Everyone does those pleas. It's a horrible thing. There's a whole group of lawyers that fight that. It's so unfair. It's so unfair. But they destroyed his life. So many other things. You look at Southern District didn't want to bring the case. Nobody wanted to bring the case. And then you know who didn't want to bring the case? Most of all is Bragg. Bragg didn't want to bring it. But then he brought it. And they tried to make it a different case. They didn't say legal expense equal legal expense. Again, if I wrote down and paid a lawyer, and by the way, this was a highly qualified lawyer. Now, I'm not allowed to use his name because of the gag order. But, you know, he's a sleazebag. Everybody knows that. Took me a while to find out. But he was effective. He did work. But he wasn't a fixer. He was a lawyer. You know, they like to use the word fixer. He wasn't a fixer. He was a lawyer. At the time, he was a fully accredited lawyer. Now, he got into trouble not because of me. He got into trouble because he made outside deals, and he had something to do with taxi cabs and medallions, and he borrowed money. And that's why he went. And then he pled to three election violations. And as soon as I saw that, I said, I wonder why he did that. He pled. He took a deal. Now, he took a deal because he wanted to get off. In other words, I'll take a plea deal, and I want to get off. And he wanted to make a deal with the Southern District. And they wrote the worst report I think I've ever seen on any human being, other than the report that was written on James Comey by the Inspector General, a very great Inspector General, actually. Wrote a report that was so bad. This one was possibly worse. the Southern District, the judge didn't let us use it. He said, it's hearsay. I said, it's not hearsay. Wouldn't let us use it. This is about the man. But he got in trouble for a very simple reason, because he was involved with borrowing a lot of money, and he did something with the banks. I don't know if it's defrauded the banks, but something happened. You guys know what it is. And then in addition to that, he gave up on 3 things where he wasn't guilty. In fact, they were going to testify in that. The head of the FEC, the Brad Smith, the election expert, #1 rated in the country, was going to testify. He took a plea on 3 things. He just added them in because that gave him more bargaining power with respect to me. But the 3 things that he pled on, having to do with the election and having to do essentially a little bit with me, they weren't crimes. They weren't crimes. Nor is paying money under an NDA. So we have an NDA, non-disclosure agreement. It's a big deal, a non-disclosure agreement. Totally honorable, totally good, totally accepted. Everybody has them. Every company has non-disclosure agreements. But the press called it slush fund and all sorts of other things. Hush money, hush money. It's not hush money. It's called a non-disclosure agreement. And most of the people in this room have a non-disclosure agreement with their company. It's a disgrace. So it's not hush money. It's a non-disclosure agreement, totally legal, totally common. Everyone has it. And what happened is he signed a non-disclosure agreement with this person, I guess other people, but it's totally honest. You're allowed to make the payment. You don't have to make it. You can make it any way you want. It's a non-disclosure agreement. And he signed that. And there was nothing wrong with signing it. And this should have been a non-case. And everybody said it was a non-case, including Bragg. Bragg said, until I ran for office. And then they saw the polls. I was leading the Republicans. I was leading the Democrats. I was leading everybody. And all of a sudden, they brought it back. It's a very sad thing that's happening in our country. And it's a thing that I'm honored. In a way, I'm honored. It's not that it's pleasant. It's very bad for family. It's very bad for friends and businesses. But I'm honored to be involved in it because somebody has to do it. And I might as well keep going and be the one. But I'm very honored to be involved because we're fighting for our Constitution. The money that was paid legally. There was nothing illegal. In fact, the lawyer in creating the NDA, because at that time he was a fully accredited lawyer. He wasn't a fixer. I never thought of him as a fixer. The media called him a fixer, or the prosecutors called him a fixer. He was a lawyer, and he was fairly good. Later on, I didn't like what he did. I didn't like, for instance, I didn't like that when I became president, he went around and made deals with companies. When I heard that, he was gone. He was gone. And he had payments coming to him. And a lot of this involved things that are very simple. There was nothing wrong. This was standard stuff, all standard stuff. Everything involved was standard. There was no crime here. In fact, I just watched a couple of the reports. You watched Jonathan Turley, Andy McCarthy, Greg Jarrett. You look at all of these people, Mark Levin, all very talented people, great people, many more, many more. And they don't know me, essentially. They don't know me. They're legal scholars and experts. But I look at them. I watched Turley this morning saying, there's no crime here. Everybody says there's no crime here, except for this DA that's got the city out of control with crime. It's absolutely out of control. So we have an NDA that was signed. We have legal expenses. And here's the thing, on legal expenses, you have 100 where they say, they do a charge. I just recorded this out. Falsification of business records in the first degree. It sounds so bad. I said, wow. And even my own lawyers, I get very upset with them because they don't say what it is. They say, well, falsification of legal records is only a felony. Well, that's a lot. That's They say a misdemeanor. But they try and bring it up to a felony if there's 2 crimes. They have all these different things. The other thing is they missed the statute of limitations by a lot. Because this was very old. They could have brought this 7 years ago instead of bringing it right in the middle of the election. So they missed the statute of limitations. They did everything. Now, let me give you the good news. The good news is, last night, we just got a report this morning, in the history of politics, I believe, maybe I'm wrong, somebody will find that I'm wrong, maybe, but I don't think so. They raised with small money donors, meaning like $21, $42, $53, $38, a record $39 million in about a 10-hour period. No, think of that. I like those people. Because so far, I guess it's backfiring. Now, I don't know. I'd rather not have it happen. I don't want to have it backfiring. I don't want to win this thing legitimately, not because they were stupid and did things that they shouldn't be doing. They shouldn't have brought this case. They were saying it this morning. This is a case that should not have been brought. I watched Andy McCarthy say this is a case that should not have been brought. And that was this morning. But they all say that. Every legal scholar has said it. And these are great people. They really understand the law. The other thing, a poll just came out. The first poll, I don't know, maybe others will be bad. But a poll just came out a little while ago. The Daily Mail. Does anybody read the Daily Mail? It's very good. They have a good poll. At least I like it today. And the Daily Mail just came out with a poll, and it has Trump up 6 points in the last 12 hours. 6 points. 6 points since this happened. Who thought this could happen? Because the people of our country know it's a hoax. They know it's a hoax. They get it. You know, they're really smart, and it's really something. So we're going to be appealing this scam. We're going to be appealing it on many different things. He wouldn't allow us to have witnesses. He wouldn't allow us to talk. He wouldn't allow us to do anything. The judge was a tyrant. And you got to see that with Bob Costello, a fine man. I've never seen anything like it, and neither has anybody that was in that courthouse where he demanded that the courthouse be cleared. Now, the good news is most of the people in the courthouse were the media. And anybody that was in the media, if you're fair, you'll say, wow, that was anger. That was crazed. He was crazed. And the reason that Bob Costello acted a little bit upset, which I think he has a right to, was that every question he was being asked was being objected to by the other side and sustained by the judge. Sustained, sustained, sustained. I think he did it many times. I don't know what the number, many times. Even I was sitting there saying, and these were basic questions. And I never saw anybody treated that way by a judge. And I've been treated very badly by 2 other judges also, because it's all the same thing. And it all comes out of the White House. Crooked Joe Biden, the worst president in the history of our country. He's the worst president in the history of our country. The most incompetent. He's the dumbest president we've ever had. He's the dumbest president, most incompetent president, and he's the most dishonest president we've ever had. And so many of he's a Manchurian candidate. You take a look at the way he treats China, Russia, so many others. You know, I ended the Russian pipeline. It was dead. He comes in and he approves it. And he gets $3.5 million, meaning $3.5 million is paid to the family, his family, from the mayor of Moscow's wife. And I said, where did that come from? Nobody wants to talk about it. But he's a very big danger to our country. And the only way they think they can win this election is by doing exactly what they're doing right now. Win it in the courts because they can't win it at the ballot box. So we're going to show them that, we're going to fight. It's actually, I don't know, it's something where I'm wired in such a way that a lot of people would have gone away a long time ago. They would have gone away after impeachment hoax #1. That was a total hoax. I had great support from the Republican Party, though. Then you had impeachment hoax #2. And then they formed the committee. How about they formed the committee of thugs, the J6 committee of thugs. And they took their records and they destroyed all of the records after the committee was abandoned because those records were great for us. Now, can you imagine if Republicans did that? Everybody would have been in jail by now.
We've been listening to former President Trump delivering remarks from Trump Tower after that historic verdict, being found guilty of 34 felony counts related to a 2016 hush money payment to adult film actress Stormy Daniels. Trump is now the first U.S. president ever to become a convicted felon, that is. He's now calling that verdict very unfair. He says this should have been a non-case, and is placing the blame partially on the Biden administration. I want to bring in our ABC News Chief White House correspondent, Mary Bruce, for a little bit more on that. Mary, this isn't the first time we've heard the former president alleging that the Biden administration was somehow involved in this, but he's talking a little more detail here than we've heard him in the past. Walk us through this, because this was a case brought by the Manhattan DA, not the federal government. So is there any base to these claims that this was somehow orchestrated by the Biden administration or the Biden campaign?
No, and look, this is a baseless narrative that Donald Trump has been pushing, that his allies have been pushing, that all of this was somehow concocted and driven by President Biden and his administration. They have argued that this is all just a political hit job, that this was a witch hunt. That is an argument that you are hearing Donald Trump make again today, and I'm sure you will hear a lot in the coming weeks and months as well. Look, what we just heard from the former president there was quite the unloading, an airing of what appeared to be a lot of pent-up grievances about the experience that he has been through for the last several weeks. He's now sort of airing that all out in the open. And while we still are waiting for an official response or any comment directly from the president himself, we are watching very closely if and when he is going to react here at the White House today. President Biden has actually been very careful over the last several weeks not to comment on this case, because he doesn't want to feed this narrative from the Trump team that this is all somehow political in nature. In fact, the president has said before that, he hasn't brought this up, he hasn't discussed this, he has had no role to play in any of this. But that doesn't stop, of course, this narrative from being baked and getting out there. And it is also part of the reason why so far we have seen actually a rather sort of muted, somewhat somber response from the Biden campaign. There's no question that this is, politically could be advantageous for the Biden campaign, but they've been very careful not to celebrate this because they don't want to add fuel to this sort of narrative from the Trump team. And so you have seen the Biden campaign, instead of, going out there and celebrating this, what they have been doing is hammering home the point that, they say, while Donald Trump may now be a convicted felon, which politically you would think would be a good thing for the Biden campaign, that ultimately they say he can still win in November. He can still be president again. And so the Biden campaign is hammering home the point that ultimately it is not up to the courts, but it is up to the American voters to decide Donald Trump's future here, Diane.
And I want to go to our executive editorial producer, John Santucci, and our investigative reporter, Olivia Rubin, who was in the court throughout the case of this entire trial. Because, John, we do have a few other points to fact check, and I do want to get to that. But there is an element to what Trump is saying in terms of the rocky road that it took to get this case into trial. Cy Vance, the original New York DA, decided after investigating not to prosecute. This DA, Alvin Bragg, also decided not to prosecute, and then later changed his mind. So walk us through that and what Trump is talking about when he's talking about that element of this case and how they ended up with the decision by Alvin Bragg to go forward with this case.
So where this all began, you have to remember, is twofold, right? It began actually with special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation, which was one of the first times that Michael Cohen started to tell all, followed up by that congressional testimony he gave before a House committee. You'll recall it. It's famous video. He called Donald Trump a liar or a cheat, a bunch of other words. Remarkable moment, considering it was the first time we had seen Michael Cohen come out in that type of way, talking about the guy that he constantly protected. That investigation then was basically handed up to prosecutors in New York on multiple fronts, because recall, Michael Cohen was convicted by prosecutors in New York's Southern District. That, of course, is the federal authority here in New York. So that is why Michael Cohen went to jail, as he spoke about this morning on Good Morning America with George Stephanopoulos. Now, in the Manhattan case, it was first launched by District Attorney then Cyrus Vance. Vance actually ran out of time, recall, because Vance did not seek re-election. So it wasn't so much that Vance didn't want to actually bring the case, it's simply the clock stopped because, you know, his term was up. The new DA, Alvin Bragg, who we saw speak to cameras last night, that did ultimately bring this case, he disbanded the team that Cy Vance brought in. You'll recall one of the prosecutors involved at that time, Mark Pomerantz, came out and wrote a book blasting Bragg and others, saying there was enough here to go forward on multiple fronts with Donald Trump. Eventually, Bragg's team was reassembled. Other people came in. A prosecutor who also worked at DOJ at one point joined that team. He was in the courtroom for a good portion of proceedings, and 2 cases were brought. First, against the Trump Organization, which we know they ultimately were found guilty in that case for the way that they had those fringe benefits that benefited Donald Trump, members of the family, other executives of the company, one of which being the longtime CFO Alan Weisselberg that Donald Trump spoke about in his remarks today. Weisselberg currently in jail here in New York for lying on the stand during Donald Trump's civil case against New York Attorney General Letitia James. So the second probe that moved forward was this one. This was the grand jury that sat for several weeks in Lower Manhattan towards the end of 2022, ultimately delivering that indictment in end of March 2023, and here we are. So all of this has been going on for quite some time, and I think the really important thing to hit on, people, let's be clear, these investigations started based on statements publicly that were made in 2018. In 2018, who was the President of the United States? Donald Trump, not Joe Biden. I think that's a really important point to make to viewers at home.
And Olivia, one of the other things we just heard Trump say is that he could spend 187 years in jail over this case. I saw you nodding your head the moment he said that. You've been in court throughout this trial, so let's talk a little bit about that element of it. But let's start first with the sentence. Scheduled for July 11th, what is he facing during sentencing?
Of course he's facing just over a year to 4 years maximum. No one thinks that he is going to be going to jail for this. We had a legal expert on talking about how this was, you know, a Class E felony. No one goes to jail for Class E felonies in his experiences. Plus, you add on the fact that Donald Trump is an older man. He has no priors. He, you know, has a lot going for him. So it's very unlikely that he's going to jail. And even if, you know, I just did the math quite quickly on my calendar, even if he took the maximum 4 years for all 34 counts, it still wouldn't add up to 187 years in prison. So that, of course, is a number pulled out of thin air. And it is not likely that Donald Trump will go to prison. He did, however, when he mentioned he was threatened with jail, that is accurate. The judge did say that if he violated the gag order one more time, he would send him to jail. He looked right at Donald Trump and said, I don't want to have to do that because you could be the next leader of the free world. But if you don't obey the gag order, you will be going to prison. And it was quite a stunning moment to threaten the former president with jail time, but also moving into some of the more substantive, you know, items he talked about. You know, he talked about not being allowed to put an election expert on. That is not totally accurate. He was allowed to put his election expert forward, but Merchan significantly limited what that expert would have been able to say. Essentially, what Merchan ruled was that he can't have a witness for the defense interpreting the law for the jury. He said, I am the only one in this courtroom that can interpret the law, so you cannot put someone on to try to do my job. And then one other thing about his own testimony. He said he wanted to testify, but he couldn't testify. He could testify. He said, you know, no one testifies. It ultimately would have hurt him. That is the decision he made. That's not to say he couldn't testify. And specifically when he says, you know, they could have asked me about everything that I ever did, what he's referring to there is prosecutors' effort to ask him about prior legal issues. And the judge did ultimately decide on that if Donald Trump took the stand, he would have been allowed to be asked on cross-examination about some of those prior convictions or gag orders. But however, the judge did limit the scope. Prosecutors, you know, to pull a random number out of my head, if prosecutors asked to ask him about 10 things, Judge Merchan said that they could ask him about 6 things. So it was a bit of a give and a take, but certainly factoring in, you don't want to talk about your previous convictions or bad acts in front of a jury. So, you know, just important to get on the record about those things that he's
ticking through and get the full context and picture around them.
Yeah, and our Rachel Scott was there in the room as former President Trump was speaking. Rachel, how was the address received there at Trump Tower?
Well, of course, you have some of his supporters lined up right to the side of the former president. He was sort of feeding off of that applause when he was delivering certain lines. But look, if this was a speech that was sort of meant to turn the page, to look ahead to the election that is less than 5 months away now, this was not that speech. You heard the former president. He went through a long list of grievances. At times, he sounded very angry and frustrated. Obviously, he's unhappy about how this all played out. He, of course, is not happy with this guilty verdict. He went on to call it all political. He went on then to not only rail against President Biden, but also he didn't really necessarily lay out any clear policies. We heard him toward the end talk about maybe immigration. He talked about crime, but didn't actually say anything that he would want to do to sort of address those issues. So for the former president, this was a space for him to come forward after all of this news coverage of his guilty verdicts, guilty on all 34 counts, come before the cameras and try to give his spin on it, try to give his narrative of it. But again, Diane, we were talking right before the former president walked out, and we were wondering whether or not the former president was going to try and shift the narrative here. We didn't really see that. We saw him revisiting a lot of the claims that he's been making over the last several weeks, a lot of the claims that he's been making on social media and on Truth Social, Diane.
And I want to bring in our legal contributor, Chris Timmons, for a little bit more on what the former president was saying about the case. Chris, I want to go to Olivia's point about him potentially testifying, right? Trump's saying that he couldn't testify because the judge had ruled they could ask him about anything. And to Olivia's point, he did rule that he could be asked about prior cases. Is that unusual for Trump to allow, for a judge to allow that broad of a scope when putting a defendant like this potentially on the stand?
Not at all, Diane. I mean, prior bad acts is codified in the evidence code across the United States. And so if somebody's done something wrong in the past, they can be asked about it, whether it's a criminal conviction or not. So that ruling was pretty standard. One of the things you've got to keep in mind on an appellate level is judges get a lot of deference when it comes to an evidentiary ruling. And that's what those calls were that Olivia was talking about. Those were evidentiary rulings. What evidence is coming in, what evidence is not. And so the Court of Appeals sort of looks at it. If you think about it as baseball, it's calling balls and strikes, and you're doing it in real time. And so that's not the luxury that they don't have the luxury of a lot of time. Of course, this particular case, he had some time to think about it, but the Court of Appeals gives you the benefit and the deference that, you know, you're the one that's watching the trial, you're the one that's seeing these witnesses live. And so it's very difficult to have a case overturned on evidentiary grounds like those six or the things that Olivia was talking about, Diane.
And Chris, we also heard Trump mention Bob Costello, who was a defense witness in the case. We heard him talk about Michael Cohen, though I'm not sure he actually said his name, but it was clear that that's who he was talking about when he said, you know, he wasn't a fixer, he was an attorney, and so on. Is he still under gag order, or is that gag order no longer since the verdict has come down? How does that work?
Yeah, so Diane, the case isn't concluded until sentencing, and so he still is under the gag order until sentencing. He might even, and I'm not sure the answer to the question, whether he's under the gag order after sentencing and when the case is up on appeal, if the gag order still applies. Typically, at that point, the baton is passed from the trial court up to the appellate court, but the trial court still has jurisdiction at this point. Now, it's less damaging because the jury's already reached a verdict. So, you know, what the former president says about Michael Cohen, what he says about Stormy Daniels isn't going to have the possibility of affecting the verdict. But the trial judge still has the case, and if he wanted to, he could find that the former president violated the gag order. Again, it's not as damaging now that we have a verdict as it would be before they testified or before the jury reached a verdict in the case. But nevertheless, until that sentence comes down, this is a pending case. It's not a final judgment.
And Rachel, we're now seeing on X House Judiciary Committee Chairman Jim Jordan has announced that he's demanding prosecutors appear for a congressional hearing.
Sorry, Diane. Yeah, I was just looking at that on my phone just now. That just came out just moments ago from Jim Jordan. And again, this is another sign of support for the former president that we are seeing from these House Republicans. I'm looking down now just to read this latest news. Yeah, Jim Jordan will demand that Alvin Bragg appear at a hearing, according to him, on June 13th to testify about what they call the unprecedented political prosecution of President Trump. This is the type of loyalty, of course, that the former president wants to see. He wants to see House Republicans and Republicans on Capitol Hill rally behind him. Now, of course, we have not necessarily heard back from Alvin Bragg of whether or not he's going to comply with this request from House Republicans, but this is sort of straight from their playbook. They will try to demand and call for many of these key players to come to Capitol Hill to testify. And again, all of that they would hope to use for political purposes as we get closer to the election as well.
And I want to go to our senior reporter, Catherine Falders, for a little bit more on that, because, Catherine, Trump's legal team is also expected to appeal here. So on what grounds are they expected to do that? What are they saying in terms of what happens next for them?
Yeah, they will appeal this, and his lead lawyer, Todd Blanche, was making the rounds on some television programs, hinting as much and stating as much, but it's not totally clear what grounds they will appeal on. They'll say potentially that the judge's instructions were unfair. They will obviously want to interview the jury if they can and maybe come up with something there, but it's not totally clear exactly what they'll do, other than that they obviously will ultimately appeal this, and it will be litigated for quite some time. Of course, we have that date, July 11th, on our calendar, and when the sentencing will be. But as Trump said in his press conference, we won't stop fighting. Of course, he's referring to the appeals. And then, of course, he has multiple other cases that likely won't go to trial before the election. So this will be the only one, obviously, that we will have seen that's gone to trial. But you can expect that this is long from the end of the road for Trump as it relates to this case. His lawyer has been calling this verdict the first step in the process. That's not totally true. Trump's been found guilty on all these counts. It should be really the end of the road for them, but they're kind of twisting it and viewing it another way, indicating that they want a long, drawn-out appeals process.
And Chris, given we're now hearing that, you know, the House Judiciary Committee is saying they want to hear from Alvin Bragg, the DA in this case, and another prosecutor, Matt Colangelo, can this case be dissected legally in terms of whether or not it should have been brought to begin with, given a jury of 12 people just decided unanimously that Trump was guilty on all counts?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. There's nothing Congress can do. It's separate sovereigns. The state of New York is a different entity from the United States government. I mean, we are a federal government, meaning we're a federation, and each of the 50 different states have their own jurisdictions, their own laws, the different things that they can do. So Congress can, you know, theoretically bring in Alvin Bragg to ask these questions, but they can't overturn the verdict. That's up for a court of appeals court in the state of New York to do if they find that there was some sort of error on behalf of Judge Merchan. But as far as Congress is concerned, they can't pass any sort of law that would acquit Donald Trump or pardon him. They just don't have that power, Diane.
And in terms of the appeal going through the legal process, do you see any points in this case, either actions by the judge or other elements of this case that could potentially leave it vulnerable, you think, to being overturned?
I mean, anytime a judge makes a decision to either let in or exclude evidence, there's going to be a ground for an appeal. That said, as I said before, trial judges get a lot of deference from the Court of Appeals in any state or even on the federal level when it comes to judges making calls on an evidentiary level. I mean, you know, juries and charges, if there were some sort of improper charges one way or another, charges that should have been given that weren't, charges that were given that shouldn't have been, that's probably a more fruitful grounds, but I'm not seeing any sort of charges or any sort of evidentiary calls that would rise to the level of something that I mean, I could be wrong. You know, there might be something there that the Court of Appeals latches onto, but I think it's highly unlikely that the Court of Appeals overturns this decision. It's a rare thing to happen.
And Catherine, what about the other cases that Trump is still facing? Because he's awaiting sentencing here on June 11th, obviously waiting to see what happens with any sort of potential appeal. But he also still faces a federal election interference case, a Georgia election interference case, and the classified documents case in Florida. So what's the latest on those cases? And could any of them see trial before November?
I don't think so. And you mentioned Georgia, Florida, and Washington, D.C., of course, the two on the federal level that are the charges that are brought by Special Counsel Jack Smith, of course, are that one here in Washington, D.C., and the one in Florida. Obviously, D.C. has been stalled as we wait for the Supreme Court to rule on a presidential immunity argument brought by Trump. But down in Florida, Trump is facing 40 counts down there of mishandling classified information and maintaining some of the nation's nuclear secrets in an unsecure environment. Those are arguably some of the most serious charges overall that he's facing, and that likely won't go to trial. That judge has pushed that back and stalled that case. Of course, there's been multiple delay tactics by Donald Trump there. I think it's worth emphasizing that after the convention, Trump is most likely to receive intelligence briefings again. So that means that he may be able to view some of that same information that he's charged with mishandling and storing improperly, and then, of course, allegedly obstructing the government's efforts to get them back. Those are serious accusations there made by the government, and he could potentially be able to view that information again. Diane, he will be in a courthouse next month in June, at the end of June, for a series of hearings down in Florida over a period of 4 days. He doesn't have to be there. He will be there, I'm told. At least right now, he's planning to be there. So another way that he is trying to use his legal problems to capitalize politically.
And Olivia, being you were in the courtroom, I wanted to ask you about one more thing that former President Trump just said, because he talked about, the judge. We've heard him say that the judge is conflicted, and he had this quote saying he might look like an angel, but really he's the devil. But then he said something else. He said that the judge crucified our witnesses. What do you think he meant by that?
He was certainly talking about Robert Costello, who was Donald Trump's witness, his really only substantive witness that he put forward to counter the narrative made by Michael Cohen that Donald Trump had opened a back channel to him via attorney Robert Costello to try to get him to not flip after his home had been raided by the FBI. So, you know, he's not wrong. Rob Costello sort of was severely admonished by the judge, Merchan, because he was showing some attitude on the witness stand. He was scoffing at Merchan's rulings. He was, you know, muttering under his breath. He was at times, you know, cutting prosecutors off with their questions. And he, at one point, struck something from the record himself. He said, strike that to the court reporter, which is the judge's job. And so it was one of the most remarkable moments of the trial. Merchan admonishing Costello, then throwing the entire press corps out of the courtroom. I wasn't in there at this time, but Aaron Katersky was tossed out of the courtroom so he could admonish Bob Costello again. So, you know, he's not wrong. His witness was crucified, but he was, you know, sort of showing some disrespectful courtroom decorum that clearly hit Merchan in a way that he felt he had been disrespected and needed to address it. But he was careful not to do that, Diane, in front of the jury. And Merchan was very careful not to do things in front of the jury repeatedly. I'm reminded of Stormy Daniels' testimony. Something that we didn't learn about until after, when the transcript from that day was released, was during a sidebar. Merchan called Trump's attorneys over, and the prosecutors, of course, and said, your client is cursing under his breath, and I'm calling you now and telling you in private so that the public and the jury can't hear, because I don't want to embarrass your client. So there were times where Merchan was clearly very careful about what the jury was seeing and what they were not, so as to presumably try to keep it as a fair process for both of them.
All right, we have to stop it there. A big thanks to our powerhouse team on this historic story. Olivia, Rachel, I won't go into everybody, but thank you all, and we are going to continue and have much more on this story right after the break. Stay here.
When a car breaks down, a race car driver would call a pit crew. You should call Endurance.
I've had 4 claims for over $8,700.
Without Endurance, breakdowns can cost thousands. With Endurance, you're covered, and you pick the mechanic you trust.
Right now, you can get $300 off any plan, plus a year of Elite benefits, a $2,000 value free, all backed by a 30-day money-back guarantee.
Call 1-833-880-5878 for a free quote.
Fresh coastlines, flavors, and family traditions. In Traverse City, there's always a fresh spin on a perfect trip. But what's even more refreshing? Being exactly where you should be. Comfortable in the moment, and wide open to new possibilities, just like Traverse City. Because keeping it fresh is always welcome in Pure, Michigan.
My melasma made me feel really ugly.
I didn't recognize myself in the mirror. I just hated taking photos.
How am I ever going to get rid of it?
Stop suffering from melasma. More than 600,000 people have regained their confidence with Muesli's prescription treatments.
In the first 2 weeks, I was amazed.
I looked at myself in the mirror and I just thought, I'm back.
I've been telling everybody about it. It's been life-changing.
Find the real you again. Go to muesli.com/TV.
If you were coming of age in the 1980s, the Brat Pack was near the center of your cultural awareness. But for those of us experiencing it from the inside, the Brat Pack was something very different. If you could have the Brat Pack name not exist, would you? I hated the Brat Pack. What a disaster.
Why did we take it as an offense? Andrew?
I'm not going to say we were the Beatles or anything.
Well, we didn't fill Shea Stadium.
1985? I think we could have.
Welcome back to ABC News Live. We are following the latest on reactions to the historic verdict in former President Trump's criminal hush money trial. But first, here are some of the other top headlines we're following this morning. Texas is bracing for another round of severe weather. Temperatures dropped from 105 degrees to the mid-50s in just 1 hour in Marathon, Texas. A severe hailstorm also rolled through, and crews had to break out snow plows to clean it up. Now states from Texas to Nebraska and Colorado are bracing for damaging winds, large hail, and possible tornadoes tomorrow. New video shows just how strong the volcano eruption in Iceland is. At least 3 homes have been burned to the ground, but residents were able to get out in time. The Iceland Meteorological Office says the greatest activity now appears to be at the crater that formed in March. Geoscientists and first responders are meeting again today to plan a response. And Cher has won a lawsuit against Sonny Bono's widow over royalties for Sonny and Cher's music. The federal civil lawsuit claims Cher and Sonny agreed to, quote, an equal division of their community property after their divorce, but Mary Bono was withholding the money. A judge sided with Cher and ruled she's now owed more than $400,000. And we will have the latest on the reaction to the historic guilty verdict in former President Trump's criminal hush money trial right after the break. Stay with us.
Fresh coastlines, flavors, and family traditions. In Traverse City, there's always a fresh spin on a perfect trip. But what's even more refreshing? Being exactly where you should be. Comfortable in the moment and wide open to new possibilities, just like Traverse City. Because keeping it fresh is always welcome in Pure, Michigan.
Generalized myasthenia gravis made my life a lot harder. But the picture started changing when I started on Vyvgart.
Vyvgart is for adults with generalized myasthenia gravis who are anti-AChR antibody positive. In a clinical trial, Vyvgart significantly improved most participants' ability to do daily activities when added to their current GMG treatment. Most participants taking Vyvgart also had less muscle weakness.
And your Vyvgart treatment schedule is designed just for you.
In a clinical study, the most common side effects included urinary and respiratory tract infections and headache. Vyvgart may increase the risk of infection. Tell your doctor if you have a history of infections or symptoms of an infection. Vyvgart can cause allergic reactions. Available as Vyvgart for IV infusion and also as Vyvgart Hytrulo for subcutaneous injection. Additional side effects for Vyvgart Hytrulo may include injection site reactions. Talk to your neurologist about Vyvgart.
First thing in the morning.
There's a lot going on.
We're still in a flash flood warning.
To catch you up with what happened overnight. Police in riot gear arresting dozens of protesters.
What's happening today? Escalating tensions in the Middle East.
What people are talking about. The migrant crisis.
Fast, straightforward.
With some fun in between.
Check out the Gator on the 17th hole.
The buzzkill in baseball.
First thing in the morning.
America This Morning.
America's #1 early morning news.
On ABC News Live.
Hey, do you know a dad in desperate need of a style upgrade? Well, GMA's got you covered. For Father's Day, we're looking for an awesome dad to give the makeover of all makeovers. Scan the QR code or go to goodmorningamerica.com and tell us why a dad in your life deserves a brand new look. It's the Dad Do-Over, a Father's Day celebration on GMA. ABC News, America's #1 news source.
Hi, I'm Diane Macedo. We begin with former President Trump reacting after that historic verdict in his criminal hush money trial. Trump is now the first U.S. president ever to become a convicted felon after being found guilty of all 34 felony counts related to a 2016 hush money payment to adult film actress Stormy Daniels. And just moments ago, he delivered remarks from Trump Tower calling the judge in the case the devil, saying the trial should have been a non-case, and railing against President Biden. We have team coverage with ABC News senior congressional correspondent Rachel Scott there at Trump Tower, ABC News senior investigative correspondent Aaron Katursky here with me in studio, and senior reporter Catherine Falders in D.C., as well as criminal defense attorney, former prosecutor Bernardo Villalona. Rachel, quick reaction to what you just heard from President Trump. In many ways, treating this both as a campaign speech and also as a way to try to fire back after this conviction came down.
It is no surprise to anyone, Diane, that Trump's legal issues have become the cornerstone of his campaign message. He talks about it on the campaign trail. He tried to turn that Manhattan courthouse into a little bit of the campaign trail, coming before the cameras, delivering his remarks, delivering his messages even. And we saw more of the same of that today from the former president. The difference here is that this trial is now over. The former president has been found guilty on all 34 counts. He was coming before the cameras today as the presumptive Republican nominee, the former president of the United States, and also a convicted felon. And you talk to a lot of Republican allies, some who really want to see the president start focusing on what is ahead, and that is the election. We know right now this is neck and neck in the polls. And so you have a lot of Republicans who also want to see the former president relay a vision for what he has for the country. Today we heard a lot of frustrations from Trump. It was more of his grievances about this trial, about the district attorney, about President Biden. He did bring up some core issues at the end, immigration, for instance, crime here in New York City, but didn't really get into specifics on what he would do to even address any of those policies. Today see more of the day after the former president wanted to come out and sort of give his side of how this all went down. And we saw him angry, at times frustrated during these remarks. And even though the former president and his campaign called this a press conference, they in fact did not take a single question from any of the reporters that were lined up here just feet away, Diane.
Aaron, sentencing is now scheduled for June 7th, and that's the big question now, is what will the former president face? He said he could face up to 187 years of jail time. We know that's not true, but walk us through why maybe he's saying that and what he is facing.
Well, he does face the potential of prison time, 1.5 to 4 years when he's sentenced on July 11th, and that will be up to the judge, who he just called the devil, and it'll be up in part to Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg, who will make some kind of a sentencing recommendation at that time during that hearing. I can't wrap my head around the idea of a former president, convicted or not, going to prison. It just seems incredible. And as a first-time nonviolent offender convicted of falsifying business records, they're just not punished that way. However, there's a small caveat that makes you wonder, and that's the way the case was charged. Prosecutors said these records were falsified to cover up a conspiracy to corrupt the 2016 election. Prosecutors called it the subversion of democracy. And maybe if the judge looks at it in that same way, perhaps putting him in jail for a little while, the judge might deem him appropriate, but we'll have to wait about 6 weeks to find out.
Bernarda, defendants are sometimes sentenced more harshly because judges say that they have shown no remorse after being convicted. Here we have a former President Trump not apologizing, quite the opposite. He is standing by everything that he said throughout, that there was no wrongdoing, that this case should never have been brought. He calls it a non-case, calling the judge the devil, calling the DA corrupt, and so on and so forth. Could that lead to a stricter sentencing come June?
So when Donald Trump is sentenced on July 11th, Judge Merchan, and he has the sole discretion when it comes to what type of sentence to actually render in this case. Anything that Donald J. Trump does say in the press, in the media, outside of the courtroom, inside of the courtroom, could be used against him. We're not dealing with the rules of evidence when we're dealing with sentencing. So in terms of sentencing, the whole purpose of sentencing is accountability, deterrence, punishment, and rehabilitation. So sending a message, I think, is going to be very crucial in the sentencing for Judge Merchan. He's going to take his lead, of course, from the evidence that he heard. And just like how Aaron said, that the severity of the underlying crime here, I think he's going to take that into account. He's going to take his lead also from the prosecution. What will District Attorney Alvin Bragg recommend, request on behalf of the people of the state of New York, who he was duly elected by to become the District Attorney of New York County? Also, the probation department is going to interview Donald Trump. What is the probation department going to recommend for this type of case? And also whatever statements that are made in the courtroom from both sides. Now, Donald Trump, yes, he has a right to speak about his case in terms of maintaining his innocence, despite being found guilty by 12 members. So in terms of whether he's going to show any remorse, there's a balance there because he wants to preserve his appeal. So he doesn't want to admit to this and still maintain his innocence. So if there is a slight chance that his conviction is overturned and there's a new trial, they won't use those statements against him in the new trial if that were to happen. So there's many possibilities, but in terms of a sentence itself, a jail sentence is a potential high possibility in this case because New York County has sentenced other defendants with no criminal record who have been convicted for falsifying business record to a jail sentence. And Donald Trump is no different. So everyone should be charged and treated to the same standard just like anyone else. So I'm curious, and I will be there on July 11th to see what Judge Merchan will issue as a sentence for these 34 counts of falsifying business records.
And Bernardo, you're right. I said June 11th before. It's July 11th. I misspoke. And the Secret Service, by the way, is also preparing for that possibility. But regardless of this sentence, Trump's legal team is expected to appeal. And I want to bring in our senior national correspondent, Terry Moran, for more on that. Because, Terry, walk us through how this process is expected to go down now. And does anything about it change, given for the first time ever, the defendant in question is a former president?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it may, but likely not. Appealing a conviction for any defendant is difficult because the jury's verdict is considered as a presumption by appellate courts to be true, that they got it right. And then they're looking at the law, and those laws will be state laws, traditional state laws of appeal. The Trump team will undoubtedly say that the judge should not have allowed certain evidence in, for example, Michael Cohen's guilty plea, or the pretrial publicity. And the publicity during the trial, which included a press conference by a man, Robert De Niro, sent by the President of the United States. That hasn't happened before. And so Trump's team will say, how can he get a fair trial when the president is sending people to call for his conviction in front of the courthouse? But the best grounds for appeal for Trump are undoubtedly in federal court. No state prosecutor anywhere in the country, in any of the 50 states, has ever incorporated federal election law into the case in the way that Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg did. And the federal courts will want to make sure, on appeal from Trump's lawyers, that we don't get a confusion of federal election law, or federal pollution law, or whatever, with courts across the country trying to enforce those laws. The Federal Election Commission did not pursue a case on these facts. The Department of Justice, on behalf of federal election law, did not pursue a criminal case on this matter. And that sense that the primary responsibility for enforcing federal law belongs to the federal government is a potential grounds for appeal for Donald Trump, no question.
Catherine, meanwhile, he does still face at least 3 other cases. A federal election interference case, Georgia, the state of Georgia is bringing an election interference case, and then the classified documents case, federal out of Florida. What's happening with those cases now, and could any of the evidence and testimony that came out during this case somehow factor into any of those?
So I don't think any of the evidence will factor into any of the federal cases or the case in Georgia here. I think the big question that you just asked is, do any of these other cases go to trial before the election? And I don't want to say no emphatically, but it really seems that none of these other ones will go ahead before the election, especially down in Florida, where the judge there has essentially punted a lot of the deadlines that are on that court calendar. That was supposed to start, that trial was supposed to start, I'm looking at the calendar, 11 days ago. Now there's no trial date for that. And I think it's worth emphasizing that Trump is facing 40 counts down in Florida for mishandling classified information, some of the nation's most sensitive secrets, and then obstructing the government's efforts to retrieve those documents. After the convention, Diane, he's pretty much set to start receiving intelligence briefings again. That means that that same material, that same information that he's charged with mishandling, that he could essentially have access to it again. Those are some of the most serious charges that he's facing. And if he wins the election, those federal cases go out the window. That's one of the first things that he is likely to do, is direct his attorney general, again, if he does win and if he is the next president, to toss out those cases. So those may never see the light of day, regardless of whether there's a trial before the election or not.
And Aaron, one of the big targets of the former president's speech just now was DA Alvin Bragg. He's the one who ultimately chose to bring this case. Trump has criticized him throughout. And it was a bit of a rocky road to get here, where Bragg initially decided not to bring charges in this case, and then ended up doing it. And as Terry points out, did it in kind of a unique use of the law. So how is Bragg now responding to accusations that this was politically motivated or otherwise?
Well, his first reaction was to try and make it as normal a case as possible. He said the district attorney's office did what it always does, and that is follow the facts and the law, and that's what led to the conclusion, the unprecedented decision by the office to charge a former president in the first place. But he insists that it is well within the bounds of what the office does, charging falsification of business records cases, and he credited the jury with following the facts the way his prosecutors did. So he's trying to encase this as just another trial by the office. He knows, however, that it is a unique defendant, and he knows the criticism, and I think that's part of the reason what he would say is why he took his time. He was handed a case that he didn't want to charge initially, certainly not the way it was presented to him, and he found this particular charge appealing to bring and a way to look at it with a somewhat unique framework, and now he's vindicated based on the jury's verdict.
And you said take his time, but the time optics are not great, given you're talking about things that happened a long time ago, and now this case coming down in the heart of election season. Former President Trump is saying, they could have brought this 7 years ago. What's Bragg's response to that?
Well, they tried. The district attorney at the time tried, but Trump fought him to the Supreme Court twice as he tried to get access to his tax returns. And by the time the evidence was prepared, the prior district attorney was leaving office and said that he didn't want to make a charging decision for his successor. So it was left to Bragg then to spend a year or so looking at it before he ultimately decided to bring the case that he did, and now has won.
Bernardo, where do you see this going next?
The day of sentencing. Also, even before Donald Trump is sentenced, remember that the defense attorney is going to file a motion to vacate the verdict. And that motion, I think, is going to be denied. There's only 3 grounds that you'll get that granted, and that is if there was jury misconduct, whether there's newly discovered evidence, or whether there's anything that has an error during the time of trial that, if it were to have been appealed, would be an automatic reversal in the Court of Appeals and the Appellate Division. So he's going to lose in that regard. So the next step after that is him being sentenced on July 11th. And once Donald Trump is sentenced, that is when the defense can formally file their notice of appeal and file their appeal and go through the process of appealing. But that can take time. That appeal is not going to be heard in 2024. But now we're just going to have to wait and see in regards to what happens on July 11th.
And Rachel, while all this is happening, we are still in the middle of an election, right? And former President Trump is not just the former president. He's not just now a convicted felon. He's also the current frontrunner for the Republican Party and the presumptive nominee. So how do you see this impacting the campaign trail?
Yeah, and look, this is a former president that has had to bounce between the courtroom and the campaign trail. We have been with him as he has done that. And then when we got that sentencing date yesterday, as all of this was unfolding, we opened our calendars and saw that sentencing date is just days before the Republican National Convention. So we are now in a scenario where the former president of the United States, the presumptive Republican nominee, will be accepting the Republican nomination from his party for president just days after his sentencing date. And again, he's running as a convicted felon. So when you talk to allies and some in the Trump inner circle, the one thing that they point to is the amount of time that they have, right? Regardless of how they view this, obviously they believe this is purely political. They kind of dismiss the idea that this is going to be a political liability for them, but they point to the idea that they have months to try to get their messaging out there, to get their narrative straight, so that when voters are walking into the polls on election day, maybe this isn't top of mind. On the other side of that, the question will be, how does the Biden campaign message around this? We've seen a little bit of their messaging so far, but how far does the president go? How often is he referring to former President Donald Trump as a convicted felon? What will he do on that debate stage? These are all questions that are going to be hanging over us as we are just 5 months out from the election, Diane.
And we will be watching closely. And Terry, whether you love Donald Trump or whether you hate Donald Trump, there was one quote from his speech today that I think everyone will be able to agree on. And he said, "This is bigger than Trump. It's bigger than me. It's bigger than my presidency." What do you think this moment means in history?
Well, we've crossed a line, haven't we? A historic line. We've never had someone who held the office of president who was a convicted felon, and Donald Trump is. And I think the consequences of that are on the positive side. You know, if future presidents commit crimes and jury finds them to be guilty, that's a good thing. That's right. That's no man is or woman or person is above the law. On the other hand, there's no question that people see this as a political prosecution, in part because of the way DA Alvin Bragg conducted his campaign for this office. And it is likely to pour gasoline on the fires of the political polarization in this country. Imagine if you're on the cheering this Trump conviction side, how furious you would be if it happened to your side. And given this precedent, it might.
All right, Rachel Scott, Aaron Katursky, Terry Moran, Catherine Falders, and Bernardo Villalona, thank you all. And we will be right back with reaction from both Democrats and Republicans as they look ahead to the president election and the potential effect this verdict might have there. Stay with us.
Fresh coastlines, flavors, and family traditions. In Traverse City, there's always a fresh spin on a perfect trip. But what's even more refreshing? Being exactly where you should be. Comfortable in the moment and wide open to new possibilities, just like Traverse City. Because keeping it fresh is always welcome in Pure, Michigan.
It's 10 feet. One shot makes you a soup for 24 hours.
Waiting for the break of day. Getting up to splash my face. Wanting just to stay away. Should I try to do so?
For moderate to severe Crohn's disease, Skyrizi is the first IL-23 inhibitor that can deliver remission and visibly improve damage of the intestinal lining.
Serious allergic reactions and an increased risk of infections or a lower ability to fight them may occur. Tell your doctor if you have an infection or symptoms, had a vaccine, or plan to. Liver problems may occur in Crohn's disease.
Control of Crohn's means everything to me. Ask your gastroenterologist about Skyrizi.
Control is everything to me.
Learn how AbbVie could help you save.
Something's coming.
Something powerful. Something suspect.
Something sexy.
Something amazing.
Everything I need is right here.
Community.
Family danger. Murder?
This world has so much to offer.
Are you ready?
Wow.
You can have it all with the Disney Bundle.
Welcome back to ABC News Live. First, both the Biden and Trump campaigns are calling for donations after the historic conviction in former President Trump's criminal hush money trial. So both candidates say the real verdict will come on November 5th. ABC News contributor, former Republican Congressman John Katkow, and former Biden administration Homeland Security official Marcia Espinosa join me now for more on this. John, the Trump campaign just put out an email, and we heard the former president reference this just a little while ago, saying the campaign raised $34.8 million in small dollar donations after the verdict came out. What are you hearing from the Republican Party about all of this? Do Republicans feel like this verdict could actually help them in November?
Well, first of all, I think it's a sad day for America. There's no question about it. A former president is now a convicted felon for the first time in our nation's history. But with respect to the impact it's going to have on the election, the base is the base. And the base already had their preconceived notions on both sides of the aisle before this trial started, and the evidence really didn't matter. What really matters is that crucial voter in the middle, that individual who's going to plug his nose and vote for Trump because they think that a second term of Biden is even worse. And those Republicans now are back in play because of this conviction. And that's why Trump has got to be careful here. He's catering to his base, but he better figure out pretty quickly that his base is with him no matter what, and he better start gravitating towards those crucial swing voters who decide every election. They're always ignored, and they're always ignored to the person's peril. He better wise up, because if he doesn't, he's going to lose them, and that's how close this election is. All the swing states indicate that.
Now, Marcia, in his comments just a little while ago, former President Trump repeated these accusations he's been making that President Biden and the Justice Department were behind this prosecution and conviction. Now, so far, there's been no evidence for that at all, and we know he was convicted by a jury in a case brought by the Manhattan DA. But do you expect the Biden campaign to start leaning into that a little and start responding to those allegations now that Trump is a convicted felon?
Yeah, so that claim, as you mentioned, is absolutely false. And I have to disagree with the congressman that this was a sad day for America. This was a great day for America, and that justice and rule of law was affirmed by 12 jurors. And the sad thing is that all of these GOP candidates are standing by a convicted felon. So what both campaigns and both sides can agree on right now is that this will be decided by the election. So what we can expect the Biden campaign to do is remind voters that there is a convicted felon on the ballot and what is at stake for this election. And the contrast is really dramatic, actually, because what we just saw in Trump's press conference today was a rambling bunch of incoherent thoughts, frankly, and a bunch of lies. And it was all about himself. He's just talking about himself. Well, on contrast, President Biden has been out there talking to voters, talking about the issues that voters actually want to hear about. So he's talking about the day-to-day concerns of people themselves, and voters want to see that.
And John, I'll give you a chance to respond to that, but I also want to get your take on Hillary Clinton is now selling a new coffee mug on social media, saying the words, "Turns out she was right about everything." Apparently, the proceeds are going to her political action organization. What do you make of that kind of response? Is that I don't know. What do you think? If Democrats are sort of looking at this as a good thing and something to celebrate?
Well, it just highlights the partisanship that permeates our political fabric throughout our country right now. And when I said it was a sad day, it was a sad day for America, not for Trump. It's for America to have a president, as a former president, be convicted. But, you know, people can argue whether they agree with it or not. That's fine. But it's a sad day nonetheless. I think the thing that's most ironic about this is, in about another week or two, the president's son is going to be on trial for criminal charges that are brought federally. First time in our nation's history, a sitting president's child is going to be brought. So the very people now that are saying the system is corrupt will probably applaud if he gets convicted. And the very people now who are saying he should have been convicted, President Trump, are probably going to say this was a politically motivated one for Hunter Biden. And by that, I'm highlighting the fact that the two sides are hardened. The bases are hardened. And again, I'll reiterate, that doesn't matter. What matters is the people in the middle who are going to decide this election. And if anybody can predict what they're going to do, I think they're dreaming right now. There's so much going on and they're going to be the difference, and both parties better pay attention to them.
And Marcia, recent polling from ABC News found 80% of Trump supporters say they would continue to support him even if he was convicted. 16% say they would reconsider supporting him if he were to be convicted. And even that was a little while ago. So how much do you think this verdict will actually impact the election? And do you think this is something that Biden should lean into or not?
Well, think about this. Hundreds of House and Senate candidates as well are going to be running for re-election with a convicted felon at the top of the ticket. So the Biden campaign and every other Democrat running for office are going to remind voters of that every day from now until November 5th. So what I think the Biden campaign is actually leaning into was what they've been doing all along, and that's talking directly to voters and issues that they care about instead of just talking about himself, which is what Donald Trump is doing. And frankly, in what we saw today in his remarks was a bunch of lies and attacks on other people. And like he mentioned that they're trying to stop us from buying cars. I didn't understand where that came from. I just bought a new car. Nobody tried to stop me except maybe my husband from another car payment. But, you know, he was attacking immigrants and attacking everyone else instead of talking directly to the voters. And so that's what the Biden campaign is really going to lean into.
All right, John Katkel, Marcia Espinosa, thank you both. We'll be right back.
Thank you.
What does it take to be the most watched newscast in America?
We are part of an operation.
Is this our combat operations center?
We're approaching the gate. Militants came in from different directions.
Nuclear reactor.
So you have a couple loaded and ready to go.
The house is destroyed, but the flag
Not a carry in it.
How important it made the USA.
Great work. Hi. Appreciate you.
Thank you.
Ismail? David.
I'm David Muir.
I know you are.
You
Watch
do.
you every night.
ABC's World News Tonight with David Muir is America's most watched newscast. With the Disney Bundle, there's something for everyone. Like
adventure,
Documentary.
and sports.
It's a luxury experience.
There's something for the whole family. With the Disney Bundle. You're watching America's #1 streaming news, ABC News Live. Breaking news, exclusives, live reporting. Keep streaming with ABC News Live.
With so much at stake in our world right now, we wanted to thank you for your trust and for making ABC News America's #1 news.
And thank you for making ABC News Live America's #1 streaming news.
Everything the light touches is our kingdom.
The sun is shining, the breeze is breezing.
I love it.
This June, feel that summer feeling that makes you want to stay inside and watch movies every day.
Did not see that coming.
Freeform's 30 Days of Disney has so many Disney movies you won't leave the house.
Why are you being weird?
But like, you should go outside sometimes.
You're mocking me, aren't you?
30 Days of Disney. Watch all June on Freeform.
Welcome back to ABC News Live. Here are some of the top stories we are following at this hour. Russia is criticizing the Biden administration's decision to allow Ukraine to use U.S.-provided weapons to strike targets inside Russia. The Russian defense minister says everything is being done to prolong and escalate the armed conflict. Allowing Ukraine to strike Russia with U.S.-provided weapons is a major reversal for the Biden administration. 2 days ago, the National Security Council spokesman John Kirby told reporters we don't encourage or enable the use of U.S.-supplied weapons to strike inside Russia. Boeing is revealing a new plan to fix its aircraft safety and quality problems. The company says it'll increase its own oversight of manufacturing and staff training and improve its anonymous reporting system for employees. The FAA chief says Boeing has laid out their roadmap, but now they need to execute. Boeing CEO David Calhoun says the actions taken by the company will strengthen all aviation safety. A second case of bird flu, a human case of bird flu, that is, has now been reported in Michigan. That brings the total number of cases in the U.S. this year to 3. Officials say the most recent case comes from a farm worker exposed to infected cows. but not from the same dairy farm where Michigan's first case confirmed earlier in May. We'll be right back.
I have moderate to severe Crohn's disease. Now there's Skyrizi.
Things are looking up. I've got symptom relief. Control of my Crohn's means everything to me. Control is everything to me.
Feel significant symptom relief at 4 weeks with Skyrizi, including less abdominal pain and fewer bowel movements. Skyrizi is the first IL-23 inhibitor that can deliver remission and visibly improve damage of the intestinal lining. And the majority of people experienced long-lasting remission at 1 year.
Serious allergic reactions and an increased risk of infections or a lower ability to fight them may occur. Tell your doctor if you have an infection or symptoms, had a vaccine, or plan to. Liver problems may occur in Crohn's disease.
Now's the time to ask your gastroenterologist how you can take control of your Crohn's with Skyrizi.
Control is everything to me.
Learn how